I guess I'll start. Hello, everyone. I'm Bonnie Lissick, the Auditor General of Ontario, and I'm here to discuss our report on on the changes to the Greenbelt. And thank you very much for your time today. I'd like to also use this opportunity to publicly thank my team of excellent auditors and professionals who worked diligently with me to complete this important report. To be able to table it today for the Legislative Assembly is my final report of Auditor General of Ontario, as Auditor General of Ontario. In January, I received a joint letter from Ontario's 3 opposition party leaders requesting an audit and an assessment of the financial and environmental impacts of the government's decision to remove lands from the Greenbelt in 2022. We initiated our work in January of this year. In conducting our work and finalizing this report, we received full cooperation from the Secretary of Cabinet and the Senior Director and General Counsel of the Cabinet Office, the current Chief of Staff to the Premier, the former Deputy Minister and staff at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and the Deputy Minister and staff from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, as well as the many others we interviewed and obtained information from throughout the course of our work. However, we faced legal pushback from 2 prominent developers we asked to meet with us. To maintain public trust and confidence, the government and its ministries need to show that they are transparent in decision-making and that they act fairly in the interests of all Ontarians. Our review of the procedures used to amend the Greenbelt boundary in 2022 raises serious concerns about the exercise used, the way in which standard information gathering and decision-making protocols were sidelined or abandoned, and how changes to the Greenbelt boundaries were unnecessarily rushed through. In essence, rather than allow the Housing Ministry's non-political public service staff to conduct a comprehensive process with expert review to identify and select lands for possible removal from the Greenbelt, the government assigned responsibility for this important assignment to political staff. The Housing Minister's Chief of Staff, who led and controlled a truncated, highly restricted selection exercise for the removal of lands from the Greenbelt. This selection exercise effectively excluded substantive input from many subject matter experts in the Housing Ministry and other ministries and municipalities, First Nation leaders, and the public. More troubling still, the process was biased in favor of certain developers and landowners who had timely access to the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff. Owners of the 15 land sites removed from the Greenbelt could ultimately see more than a collective $8.3 billion increase to the value of their properties. In June 2022, following the general election, the Housing Minister received direction from the Premier's office to complete work to codify processes for swaps, expansions, contractions, and policy updates for the Greenbelt, specifying that the work should be done in fall 2022. A few weeks later, the Premier's office assigned a political staff member to be the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff. This political staff member would become the key person to lead this initiative. Emphasizing the need for expediency and confidentiality, the Chief of Staff directed the Housing Ministry's Deputy Minister in the first week of October 2022 to set up a team of non-political civil servants, initially of 6 staff, who in our report we refer to as the Greenbelt Project Team, to assess which sites might be removed from or added to the Greenbelt. Team members signed confidentiality agreements. The Chief of Staff also gave the team the criteria they should use to make their assessment and requested that this work be done within a 3-week period. What followed cannot be described as a standard or defensible process. Even though hundreds of site removal requests had been submitted to the ministry in the 17 years since the establishment of the Greenbelt in 2005, the team only assessed 22 sites as options for removal from the Greenbelt, of which 21 were provided to them by the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff. Further, 2 prominent developers provided packages containing information about 2 of the Greenbelt land sites to the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff at a dinner function held by the Building Industry and Land Development Association in September 2022. After the event, the Chief of Staff indicated that one of those developers provided him with information requests to remove an additional 3 land sites from the Greenbelt, which included 1 site related to a 3rd developer. Of the 15 sites ultimately selected, these 5 land sites represent about 92% of the approximately 7,400 acres removed from the Greenbelt in December last year. As the Greenbelt selection project proceeded last October, assessment criteria were dropped, or site boundaries were altered to facilitate the selection of most of the sites for removal from the Greenbelt. For instance, when the ministry identified that 19 of the 22 proposed sites did not meet the 1 environmental criterion, that criterion was dropped. In another example, when the confidentiality restrictions imposed on the Greenbelt project team made it impossible for the team to assess how quickly infrastructure could be built on the proposed lands, those criteria were discarded too. Internal government decision-making material prepared for Cabinet by the Housing Ministry did not clearly describe the exercise used to identify, assess, and select the Greenbelt land sites. As a result, key decision-makers told us they were not aware of key limitations in the exercise to amend the Greenbelt boundary when they were asked to approve the Greenbelt amendment proposal. We also noted that fair, transparent, and respectful consultation did not take place. We found that the Housing Ministry's public consultation period, which is required by the Environmental Bill of Rights, was undermined by incomplete and inaccurate notices on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, limiting the public's ability to fully understand and comment on the proposed changes and their potential impacts. Nor did the Housing Ministry carry out a comprehensive analysis of the 35,000 comments posted on the registry, which were overwhelmingly negative, and ultimately no revisions were made to any of the proposed land removals. We also noted that the Greenbelt Plan, which derives its authority from the Greenbelt Act of 2005, specifies that the Ontario government shall consult with First Nations on decisions that may affect Aboriginal and treaty rights within the Greenbelt. But according to First Nation leaders we spoke to, consultation was insufficient to meet the province's duty to consult. We also found that the exercise used was dismissive of land use planning. Land use planning is an important process that guides decisions about how and where development can occur, while safeguarding valuable and sensitive resources such as agricultural lands, wetlands, and forests. About 83% of the land area removed is of the highest quality and capability for agriculture. Further, 11 of the 15 areas removed from the Greenbelt contained lands within the Natural Heritage System, which captures areas with the most sensitive or significant natural features and functions in Ontario. About 14% of the Greenbelt removals accounted for almost 1,000 acres and are wetlands and woodlands. The Greenbelt exercise calls into question who, if anyone, was supervising the non-elected Chief of Staff as he personally directed the Greenbelt project team through most of October 2022. The Housing Minister informed us that he was not aware of the specifics of what his Chief of Staff was working on in terms of the Greenbelt site selection exercise. And the Chief of Staff told us that he did not inform the Housing Minister of his part in the Greenbelt amendments. In our view, the Housing Minister ought to have known the key details of such a high-profile and politically sensitive government exercise and ensured that Cabinet and the Premier were also made fully aware of these details. The actions to amend the Greenbelt boundary also call into question why the government needed to make such a significant decision so quickly. We found that the reasoning for the Greenbelt changes was just as flawed as the selection process itself. No doubt, the prospect that Southern Ontario will see strong population growth for the foreseeable future provides the province with compelling grounds to prioritize residential construction. However, our report notes the following. In March 2022, the government adopted the Housing Affordability Task Force report as the source of the goal to build 1.5 million homes over 10 years. The report itself specifically states that land is available both inside the existing built-up areas and on undeveloped land outside of greenbelts. Further, we found that the Housing Ministry had already allocated the entirety of the 1.5 million unit housing target to Ontario's municipalities in October of 2022, 1 month before the government's November 2022 proposal to remove land sites from the Greenbelt. As well, the chief planners in the regions of Durham, Hamilton, and York, home to all 15 sites removed from the Greenbelt, told us that Greenbelt land was not needed and that there is sufficient land outside the Greenbelt in their regions that is already serviced with infrastructure or can be more easily serviced to meet the housing targets that, as mentioned, had already been assigned to them by the Housing Ministry in October 2022. I would like to draw your attention to the report we issued in December 2021 titled Land Use Planning in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Given the increase in the use of MZOs, which override the normal land use planning process, it is important to reflect on the use of MZOs in conjunction with today's report. Development companies cannot be assured of the fair and level playing field in which they need to conduct their businesses, and communities and their residents have no idea whether plans that have been carefully crafted to achieve a vision for their communities will be respected. While the people of Ontario deserve prompt action to solve societal problems like those generated by the need for housing, this does not mean that government and non-elected political staff should sideline or abandon protocols and processes that promote objective and transparent decision-making that is based on good information. In our view, the 2022 Greenbelt exercise clearly demonstrates what can happen when a policy directive such as opening the Greenbelt to enable development is then implemented with few procedural safeguards or little expert input. Put more bluntly, expediency should not be used as a justification to short-circuit sound operational procedures. Our report includes 15 important recommendations that stem from our work. They cover the need for clarification of roles and responsibilities between political and non-political public service staff, limiting the use of public service staff having to sign confidentiality agreements when conducting their work, emphasizing the need for compliance with the Public Service of Ontario Act when liaising with third parties with vested interests in the outcome of decisions, strengthening oversight powers of the Office of the Integrity Commissioner of Ontario, clarity regarding email retention and restrictions on the use of personal email for government business, meaningful and intentful consultation processes, complete cabinet submission information with the ability of non-political staff to document their expressed concerns around lack of process, evidence, and information. And finally, given that both the Premier and the Housing Minister communicated to us that they were unaware that the 2022 pre-selection of Greenbelt lands for removal was biased and flawed, we recommended that the government revisit the particular land site selections that were made to adjust the Greenbelt boundaries now that it has the benefit of the information contained in this report. And now I would be pleased to take your questions. And I just want to say one thing too before I do answer questions, is that I do want to say kudos and really congratulations to really great investigative reporting, and I believe it came from the Narwhal. I believe there was CBC involved, and I do believe a little bit from the Star as well. And thank you for that. I think the investigative reporting has a place and a future still, and good work.
Bonnie, in my understanding is that the act that governs your work doesn't require you to go to law enforcement with anything that you find that might be criminal, whereas in the Integrity Commissioner's case, the legislation that governs their work does. Do you think that anything criminal happened here, and do you think the OPP should investigate?
We have a section in our act that says we can provide advice or information to those within the public service. The OPP is within the public service in Ontario, so that is sort of that pathway. You know, to be honest, we had a meeting and we've had discussions, but my understanding is yes, and my understanding is that you know, whatever happens in the future will be up to the OPP to decide whether there is merit in looking at any situation further.
Those discussions entailed with the OPP?
I can't. You know, it's not something we've put in the report, and I think it's probably best if there is any decision by the OPP at any point in time that they decide whether they take, you know, pursue anything. You know, we're not the police, so we're in our lane here.
Do you think the police should investigate?
You know, I think I'll leave that up to them to answer. You know, our work is in the report, and I think, you know, anything else beyond that is either with the Integrity Commissioner or with other parties.
Auditor General Lissick, you tried to speak to a couple of developers, and you did issue summons, I believe. What did you want to speak to them about? What questions did you want to ask those developers specifically?
I think, you know, broadly, we wanted to understand their perspectives on the lands that they had, on the, you know, why their lands were selected, what their thoughts were when they were asked about their lands being removed from the Greenbelt or told. So I think it's normal to have heard from them and heard what their perspective was on the decision-making around the removal of the lands they own from the, or are developers for from the Greenbelt.
Follow-up, please. What documents and information did you have access to whilst conducting the reviews? Was it mostly based on interviews, or were you given more access than that?
You know, we have, we don't particularly detail all of that information in our report, but I can say we have a scope section where we did say there were limitations to our work. And we have a section in there that says, should anything else come to our attention, that the office would consider pursuing and conducting any additional work that's necessary.
Prominent developers we're talking about who challenged your orders for an interview, are they the same prominent developers mentioned in the September 14th event?
Yeah, I think you can, from our report, you could probably get that is the case, yes.
Did you reach any conclusion on what the Premier's role was in this while he was defending these decisions?
You know, I did meet with the Premier and I asked pretty direct questions of the Premier, and in all cases he indicated that he was not aware of the specifics around the selection of the land, and that he did not tell anybody to put in submissions for the removal of the land. So that is the information I received from the Premier.
Do you believe the Premier when he said that, and or the Housing Minister, that they actually had no knowledge of this and it was all just this Chief of Staff?
You know, I have no reason not to believe them. I think given everything we've seen, I think that, you know, our recommendations stemmed from that as well, because if you're not aware of a process where decisions, pretty important decisions, are being made, then, you know, it makes sense to revisit those decisions in light of new information. So that is how we've handled this.
Are you saying then that this is just one rogue Chief of Staff who did this all on his own and broke protocols and rules?
I think what we're saying in there, we are questioning that somebody could, you know, manage an initiative like this without any type of supervision or oversight. And so the way we've concluded on that is that we do say we do believe the minister ought to have known. The minister indicated to us he did not know, but given the importance of this, it would have been, I think most people would have presumed he would have been aware.
But if he was given this responsibility from the Premier's office, should they not have known and been aware as well?
So we've had those discussions. We did a number of interviews, and we have no information that would confirm that he was receiving direction, particularly from anybody specifically.
And the allegations have long been that someone in this government tipped off developers that this land was going to be opened up, and where. Has any of that come to light? What is your response to those specific allegations?
I would say in the back of our report, we have an appendices that has a timeline. And, the chief of staff started in his new role at the beginning of July, and then a couple months later, material starts being given to the chief of staff. So we do wonder how that process came about and why people would bring material like that and provide it to the chief of staff. Having said that, we have no other information around that situation to outline in the report today.
Are you suspicious?
I think we did get, had good information provided to us of how things proceeded, but naturally there are a few questions, like sometimes we have on other audits that are unanswered, and I think what we have in the report is answers the question of how the lands were selected from the Greenbelt, which I think was a key ask of us when we were asked to do this audit.
Following up the Auditor General, the idea that a chief of staff would receive packages at a dinner, and that these packages, as it turned out in your report, included land that made up the majority of these lands that were then going to be made available. Does that seem kosher to you? Does that seem normal to you? And then, as Global reported, there was the Stag and Doe where the developers were at the Premier's party. When you put two and two together, what does it add up to?
So during the course of our work, we saw a lot of communication. So I guess the premise here is it's okay to lobby in Ontario. It's okay to try and get your interests met. It's how the receiver of that information handles what they receive from lobbyists. As a result of what we saw during the course of our work, we put recommendations in here that we think are needed to be looked at to address some of the concerns around what are the roles and responsibilities between the public service and the political public service. How should materials that are received from people that are lobbying for their purposes and be handled and shared among the political staff and the non-political staff? And the integrity commissioner's role in looking at all of this. So I think there is a bigger picture around all of this in terms of more understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are in working with third parties that are vested interests. So we've addressed it that way in the report.
How did you find out that this package changed hands in this September 2022 meeting?
I think we've indicated that the chief of staff did cooperate with us, and the chief of staff indicated that that was the case.
Premier Ford, not too long ago, said that you're out of your lane for looking at this. This is not in your purview. You're supposed to look at budgetary items. How do you respond to that?
I think the key thing here is that everyone refers to the term value for money, but maybe look at the root. I'm an Auditor General, audit. Our office is the Office of the Auditor General. We're auditors. Auditors look at information and want to communicate how processes work or are not working throughout what we look at. We're completely in our lane, and we've always been in our lane. The thing about that type of comment that I find, I listen to and I accept, is that it diverts attention away from the reports that we write and the work that the office does. So it's not just about the Auditor General or about Bonnie Lissick, it's about the content of our work. And I think comments and even different articles that divert are not doing justice for the people in Ontario, because it's the content of our work that's really important to get at versus, personalities or are we doing the right work. I think when there is a concern raised, the issue should be about how does the concern get fixed.
You talk about preferential treatment for some lobbyists in part of your report, and you mention staff be setting up investment opportunity meetings. What are these meetings, and how frequently do they happen?
Yeah, I think, I'm comfortable leaving it as it is in there to just indicate that, there are issues, I think, that need to be thought about. I think, there is that definition of what is policy and what is operations. So opening the Greenbelt, but is picking the lands to pull out of the Greenbelt really policy, or is it something that requires expertise? So what we've done in that section is indicate that there are situations where outsiders can influence operations of government, and that's where we think more attention is needed to define that line between reliance on a qualified civil service, experts in municipalities, experts in conservation authorities. Political staff have a role, but is it to make absolute operational decisions?
In this report that public consultation was once again subverted, and it wasn't done adequately and sufficiently. You found that for Bill 23 as well, and a couple of reports before then, too, if I'm remembering correctly. It seems like the government hasn't taken the past recommendations you made about improving the transparent consultative process when it comes to environmental policy changes. What would you say after this thorough investigation you've done in Greenbelt changes?
I would say that is an important thing to keep your eye on. I find it is really dismissive and disrespectful of people who write in and have concerns about things that don't get their concerns addressed. So there needs to be some change and recognition that when we all spend our time responding to what looks like a consultation process, that it's respected. And I think what we've seen over the years, that consultation in a number of cases, especially with respect to the Environmental Bill of Rights, sure, there's a mechanical process. You put something on a registry and you ask for a 30-day response. That's the mechanical side. But the real side is, what is the content of what you're getting responses to about what you do? And I don't think we're seeing full responses. And the other is the timing. So is it realistic, especially in the case of this situation, to have asked people to respond to something as important to people as opening up in an area that has some will have environmental impacts to it, and ask for 30 days? And if you look at that response time too, it also there was another one that was posted that it was just after a municipal election, and you're asking municipalities to have input when they don't even have a council in place. Like, that whole consultation area, I do believe, needs to be rethought and really respected. Otherwise, you get a population that doesn't believe it makes a difference whether you comment or not. It's like whether you vote or not, you know?
Is there any recourse for the public or for the Indigenous communities or even municipalities that weren't consulted for all these major land use changes?
I think recourse is probably voice. I mean, I don't speak for the Indigenous community, but they did tell us they had concerns. But I do think, go just a little bit, maybe it's part of that answer to that question, but also I'm just thinking as I'm speaking here that what's really important too is that you have a very important role to play as a media to have people understand where their voice needs to be heard or if it's not heard. So I would say there's a lot of new people coming to Canada, and perhaps some of these issues are new, and they might not have all the information they need to make their own decisions around things.
Auditor, you're saying this one political staffer with a very accelerated process, a few envelopes at a dinner, is able to provide $8.3 billion in additional value to these developers. Should this guy still have a job?
We have a recommendation in the report that there be a referral made to the Integrity Commissioner to see whether or not there was a breach of the Public Service Act of Ontario. So we've indicated that in the report. I do know the Integrity Commissioner is also conducting their review and will be reporting publicly and might have more to say.
Auditor General, notwithstanding this particular staffer's role in all of this, do you agree that the buck stops with the Premier's office, because the Premier's office appointed that person to conduct this work and to take on this responsibility? Was it the Premier's office responsibility to be accountable for it?
The document that was approved by all of government was a cabinet submission, and so the cabinet approved the removal of the lands. That document was provided just a couple hours before cabinet, so I would say the decision ultimately was one of the government. I think I go back to why we made the recommendation we did, is that given what we saw during this audit and what's in the report, that there's ample support for looking at the removal of those specific land sites. So given we were told that that document was not as complete as it could be, perhaps decisions were made that might be worthy of a second review.
What was incomplete about that document?
It didn't speak to how the lands were selected. It also didn't explain that what the limitations of the criteria used were and how the criteria evolved and changed. There was also an implication that the lands could be developed quicker, and we know that that was not an assessment criteria. We know that the ministry had indicated they did not have time, or they weren't able to contact municipalities or conservation authorities to ask for good information as to how that land or when that land could be developable.
But you have a small number of people making billions. You have protocols that were not followed. You have the land that was changed so that it did meet the criteria when in fact it did not. Is something stinky here?
Yeah, we have concern around what we saw, and hence I think you'll see the terminology that we've used throughout the report is this is a flawed process, this was a biased process. We saw what we think is preferential treatment. There's answers still to be obtained in a few areas. So I do believe we are saying this was not, we aren't even referring to it as a process in our report. We're calling it an exercise.
Is any of it criminal in nature in your mind?
You know, that's outside of my purview, so, you know, it wouldn't be fair for me to comment on that.
On what Minister Clark, no, there's a part in the report that says there was a letter sent by a lawyer to his chief of staff, but the letter was to Minister Clark about one of the parcels of land that was ultimately removed, one associated with Shakira Ramatullah, who went to the wedding and just followed the wedding. Did the minister ever read that letter? And if he did, is it possible he didn't know what was going on by his chief of staff?
I think, you know what, I think that would be a good question for the minister. All we know with respect to that is that was material that was then provided to the ministry to use as information as to what lands to look at for removal.
Or is there a reason you're not using his name?
We typically don't name people in our reports. We try and use the titles of people in our reports.
This is the current chief of staff for Minister.
This is the
Clark.
current chief.
Okay.
Bonnie, you know in your reports, in your recommendations, there's recommendations about records retention, personal use of emails, and of course there was the developers who filed in court to resist some of what you were asking for. What are the gaps of what you were trying to figure out that you weren't able to? Were there any that were significant?
Yeah, I think we made those comments because we did do email reviews, and in some mailboxes we can see information that we would have expected to see in other email boxes. I wouldn't say we were extremely concerned about what we didn't see, but we were concerned that there might not be clarity around what is kept and what isn't kept, and hence we made that recommendation. Also, you know, when you're looking at people having meetings, especially when meetings are with third parties, that it would be a good practice to document the purpose of meetings in meeting agendas, and so we didn't see a lot of description around some of the meetings that we were looking at.
Were there any particular parts of the saga, I guess the story behind how these lands were chosen that you weren't able to identify, that still to you is a mystery after doing this work?
You know, I'll just back up a step too. The other part of this is we do have a comment in there that information can sometimes be sent to people's personal emails, and we wanted to emphasize in the report that government business should be on government emails, not on personal emails, and that because that is a risk as well, because personal emails become then subject to FOI. I think what I would say is that right now, based on what we know, we think our report is complete. Could there be other information over the course of the next while that becomes new information? We did put a paragraph in our report that indicated that would be something we looked at. So I guess I'd say, you know, never say never, that, you know, there might be something else that we haven't looked at, but we feel pretty confident with the material that's in our report. And I think what's important about it are the recommendations, and that they're timely.
The preferential treatment of lobbyists. You mentioned that there was a practice of taking possible wording for legislation from lobbyists, then putting it in a folder and sending it to the deputy minister. Can you tell us what any particular legislation was affected by that practice?
You know, I can speak to what we have in the report only without getting into details. But I think generally it could be that sometimes the civil service, so the non-political staff, might be asked to do something or to use certain information without understanding where that comes from, whether it's an instruction from a premier, whether it's instruction from a minister, whether it's actually political staff that come up with that idea, or whether it's a third party. And what we're saying is that there should be clarity around all that, because what we did see is perhaps that misunderstanding happening.
Going to happen now with the legal challenges from the two prominent developers? Are you still going to be trying to get to enforce your order to have them sit down, or is that moot at this point?
So, you know, we had tried to have just meetings. That didn't work, so we did issue the summons, and the summons were, you know, there was a challenge, and you know, I made the decision that it's why would we do that? Why would we again go through an exercise to get information that really we should be able to get under our act? So bottom line on that is, it's in the report. It's referred to the Legislative Assembly. We have two sections in our act. One says we can talk to people to get information. The other says we can use the Public Inquiries Act. The Integrity Commissioner has used the Integrity Inquiries Act and summonsed, and to him there was a positive response. So right now where it sits is, I made it very clear through our legal counsel that we're not pursuing that way, but we're open to conversation, and should there be a decision from the developers that they'd like to talk to us, we're open to hearing from them.
Auditor General, you spent 6 months on this. It's a comprehensive report. There's some pretty damning conclusions. There's a lot of information in here. What do you think about the public trust? Because the public looks to you in the course of looking at this report and saying, she did this work, she issued these recommendations, she had access to all this information, this document. Should the public have the feeling out of all this that the government got away with something because they pushed this through, the process wasn't done according to the way that you say it should have been done, but what are we gonna do about it at this point? Deal is done, monies are gonna be earned, profits are gonna be substantial, but what's the upshot? Do you think the public should feel like the government got away with something here, or that there's any recourse at all?
You know, I think the thing is, I don't know if it's too late to make a different decision. I mean, I think the implication is just because the decision was made in the past that it has to be followed through with. I mean, there's been other decisions that have been reversed. I would say, you know, if you think to your own personal situation, if new information is brought to your attention on a decision you've made, chances are you're going to sit back and reflect and go, you know what, was that the right decision, or should we be doing something else? So I would say I'm not sure it should be, the decision should reside where it is without a second reflection. So that would mean to me then, if it wasn't looked at and re-reviewed, that everybody's okay with how the decision was made.
Would you like it reviewed?
We recommended that based on the fact that both the Premier and the Minister did not know how these lands were selected. And now you know, what this looks like, and you see basically that it wasn't a fair process. It would seem reasonable to have made that recommendation.
Tell you about the loan recommendation that they did not accept. And
you know, I should stress, we had very good cooperation from the current Chief of Staff to the Premier, from the Secretary of Cabinet and her team, and there is agreement on 14 of the 15 recommendations. That is likely one that both the Minister and the Premier themselves will have to, with government, would make a decision on how they address it. But I think the Chief of Staff to the Premier was very comfortable in providing responses to the other 14.
was this reassessment that they did not agree with it?
There isn't, we don't have a comment of agree or not agree. That the way it was left is that'll be a decision of the government.
Particular recommendation though.
Correct.
Auditor, how believable is it to you that the housing minister did not know what his chief of staff was doing in personally picking these 14 or 15 properties? Do you believe that?
So, when somebody says to me, I was not involved in that process, I did not know how the lands were chosen, I believe. Having said that, do I believe that, that he should have known or he ought to have known? Yes.
Do you believe that would be a wise decision or helpful for rebuilding public trust by having the current chiefs of staff or possibly Minister Clark relieved of their positions?
You know, that's not for me to comment on or decide, right? That'll be a decision that the government themselves will make in terms of how they move forward.
Auditor, you said the owners of the removed sites could see more than a $8.3 billion increase in the value of their properties. You write that it came out of a valuation from 2016, 7 years ago. Could the land not be worth much more given that?
Definitely. It's definitely more than that. You're absolutely right. Those are 2016 numbers. At the time when we were obtaining information from MPAC, that information wasn't available, but it likely will be available as time passes. So it'll be a fair amount more.
When do you think we might know that?
You know, that'll be a question for, I think that's a good question to ask the ministry as well as MPAC on what their estimates of it are.
Given you're coming to the end of your 10-year term, we're talking about a one-day decision or a few weeks decision that delivered at least $8 billion to the private sector. Can you compare this over the other issues you've had to wrestle with? Where does this one fit in terms of how egregious it is?
You know, they're all the various work that we've done over the last 10 years has been very different. Each file is unique. I would say this one is unique in the sense that when we started the work, we thought there would be a financial process to look at, and we thought there would be an environmental process, and so we were ready to go and look at those processes. And then we recognized that there were no processes here. This was this exercise. And what it meant to us is that I had to work in clearing the report both with the political side of the government as well as the non-political side. And I would say that's what's unique about this report, is that typically when we do audits, we clear our work with the people that are involved, and we're auditing the work of the non-political staff. In this case, it took us into a bit more of the political governance structure, and but I think we were successful in clearing this report and working through as best we could under the circumstances. So that's what's unique to this one. That's what I'll remember, is the unique clearance process that we worked through on this file.
What do you think about having a full public inquiry about this?
You know, that's not for me to comment on. That's a different territory.
Did you, in your office, look into if anyone in the government personally benefited from any of these decisions?
We have nothing in our report identifying that anybody personally benefited from this.
Was that something that you asked or looked into?
You know, that is something that we thought about. You know, again, there is probably more work to come, more reporting from the Integrity Commissioner. But I don't have a response to that.
Well, it sounds like the question might have been asked.
Yeah. I think it's a question to be asked, but we didn't. We did not report anything on that.
We'll go to the phone lines now for questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 now. Once again, if you are dialed into the audio conference and you would like to ask a question, please press star 1. There are no questions from the phone lines.
Your your successor will be chosen to be less confrontational with the government, or be less to dig into things like this, because they don't want you to be in this lane. Are you worried that whoever they choose next will be someone who will stay in whatever the government determines to be their lane?
I think it's important that the person that comes into this role knows how to do the work, in the sense, what is the role of an auditor? And it's important that the panel that is being put together to hire the auditor thinks about that, no matter what party they're involved with, because at some point you're government and some point you're opposition, and what you want is somebody that will, and I hope I've done this, is tell it like it is. At the end of the day, it's not a, it's how can I say this? This is a role that, there was an article written the other day. It says, everybody hates Bonnie, but she's successful. And I'm going, okay, I'm not out to be hated, and my objective was just to do good work. But I think what's important here is to keep your eye on that selection process. The panel is a government member and an opposition member. So those individuals have the power to select an Auditor General. The vote in the legislature is, I believe, 75%, not 100%, but it's at the committee level that it'll be important. I do believe, I do believe they'll try and find a person that will be 100% equipped to do the work for Ontario.
You mentioned just lastly the need for a new process similar to in the UK for senior non-political civil servants to dispute or raise issues when they're giving instructions that they believe contradict what they're supposed to do. Do you feel in this case that that level, the neutral non-political civil servants, acted appropriately, did what they could to try and check or mitigate this process?
I think it's difficult, right? Because at the end of the day, the Deputy Minister reporting channel is into the Secretary of Cabinet. That's the bureaucracy. And the other side is the political side, which is your Minister and your Chief of Staff. And everybody has to work together to make sure the decisions are well informed. I think in this case, the Deputy Minister assumed that the Minister and the government were well aware of how the sites were being selected, and we do say that in the report. But after reflecting on it, I think what she would do differently is raise it to the Secretary of Cabinet as a concern, and also make sure that the documentation that goes to Cabinet is more explicit on the concerns of the civil service when decisions are being made.
Or is this a government intent to push this through and nobody was going to be able to stop it?
I guess at the end of the day, I have to go that if the Minister and the Premier say they didn't know what the process was, then I think the next step is to revisit a decision. And so I guess the actions will speak louder than the words, right?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, and all the best.
All right, let's get going. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The findings of this report are damning. It's clear that the Conservatives' Greenbelt grab, their decision to remove protected lands from the Greenbelt so a select number of their donors could develop them, isn't incompetence or an inability to address the housing crisis. Let's call this what it is: corruption. Ordinary Ontarians are struggling every day right now. Struggling to afford their rent, their mortgages, groceries, gas, everyday essentials. And instead of helping you, the Conservatives have chosen to help a select number of their Conservative Party donors to the tune of $8.3 billion. Ontarians deserve better than a government that rewards, that enriches a select number of their party donors at the expense of everyone else, and at the expense of every single one of you across this province. It's very clear from this report that this goes all the way to the top, all the way to the Premier. His fingerprints are all over this. This is part of an obvious culture of corruption across this Conservative government. The process is rigged to serve the very wealthy and the very powerful. And despite the clarity that's been provided by the Auditor General in this report, despite the appalling details of this report, we know that there is still more to uncover. Earlier this year, I filed 2 complaints with the Integrity Commissioner. The first was on the actions of Minister Clark and his staff to better understand who knew what and when on the Greenbelt grab. The second was on the connections between the Premier, his family, and the developers who benefited from the government's abrupt policy change. So we know there's even more to come. But based on the details of this report, I am calling for 3 immediate actions. The Premier must immediately recall the legislature. The Premier must do that so that we can reverse course and return these lands to the Greenbelt and cancel these deals with developers. Secondly, Minister Clark needs to resign or be removed from cabinet immediately. And third, that this Conservative government not stand in the way of the Integrity Commissioner's investigation, including any potential criminal investigations arising, because we know this is just the beginning and the public deserves to know everything. Political actors across the Conservative government must be held to account. And as the leader of Ontario's official opposition, I want to restore Ontarians' trust in their government. We need real consequences for these actions, not just a shuffling of personnel. Because your government should be helping you, not helping themselves and their ultra-rich and powerful donors. Ontarians are in a housing crisis. Rents are through the roof. We don't have the homes that people need, and not just now, but let alone in the future. The Conservatives, Premier Ford, are going to try and tell you that this was all about building housing. It's not. Instead of building the homes we need, they rigged the system to benefit a handful of Conservative donors. And in fact, this is going to make the housing crisis worse. We've wasted precious time. We've set everything back. It's unacceptable. I want to really take a moment to thank the Auditor General and all of her staff for their extraordinary work, and to her team for this report, and also the journalists who've also been conducting excellent investigative journalism. I think the people of Ontario have benefited. I'm joined here today by 2 of our critics in the official opposition, Sandy Shaw, who is our environment critic, and Catherine Fife, who is our finance critic. And with that, I'm going to turn this over now to NDP finance critic Catherine Fife.
Thank you so much, Marit. This report is clear. The Conservative government is transferring wealth from Ontarians to a select few Conservative Party insiders to advance their personal and their political interests. I mean, the Premier provided a hand-picked staff to be a direct line for developers. We've seen this film before, the Liberals' gas plant scandal, and actually I was here for that. This is way bigger than that. This is yet another example of a government that has no respect for taxpayer dollars or the interests of everyday Ontarians. This value for money audit shows that while Ontarians continue to struggle with the cost of living crisis and skyrocketing housing costs, developers and donors got the best bang for their buck. They got special treatment. With the Greenbelt grab, the government has transferred public assets to gift billions of dollars to private donors and developers. Ford forfeited agricultural potential and compromised environmental protections, all to line the pockets of hand-picked developers. I mean $8.3 billion, from sealed envelopes to USB keys to exclusive trips and dinners with developers. The Integrity Commissioner is going to have a field day. The only criteria that these pockets of land met, and this is a key part, was that they directly met the needs of developers whose interests align with the Conservative Party. In the AG's own words, the selections of land sites were biased, lacked transparency, and were made by the Chief of Staff who directed the Greenbelt project team with instructions from the office of the Premier. Every decision made by this government on the Greenbelt has been fiscally irresponsible and counter to public interest. Under a directive from the Premier's office, these 15 land sites were selected without assessing or considering the cost of making those lands developable, or whether they would even produce the housing needed. This was never about housing. While select donor developers made upwards of $8.3 billion from these land swaps, these boundary changes would leave Ontario taxpayers on the hook for the cost of funding the necessary infrastructure to even be able to build on these lands. This government has already sold municipalities short by taking away development fees and undermining their abilities, and now they're leaving taxpayers and municipalities to foot the bill for their billion-dollar scheme. It is indefensible, in the words of the Auditor General, and it is absolutely making the housing crisis worse. Sandy.
Thanks, Catherine. This report makes clear the damage facing our wetlands, forests, and agricultural land. 83% of the lands removed from the Greenbelt were some of the highest quality and capability for agriculture. 4,700 acres of prime agricultural land gone. And we know once it's gone forever. If we can't produce our own food, we're going to have to import it, and we know that we're going to have to pay even more at the register. There are 22 species at risk in the Dufferins Rouge Agricultural Preserve. 1,000 acres of wetlands and woodlands have been removed from environmental protection. Destroying this habitat will have devastating consequences. Further, the 2,400 acres that the government added to the Greenbelt, supposedly to offset these removals, were already protected, already largely undevelopable, and do not meet the Greenbelt Plan objective. We can't forget that this was done without consultation with the people of Ontario, without any consultation or engagement with First Nations. Instead, it was all done in the Conservative backrooms. Ford called the Greenbelt a scam. This is the real scam. These backroom dealings, these unacceptable policy reversals are the scam. I mean, $8.3 billion. Clearly, the people of Ontario are getting scammed by this government. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Sandy. As you will know, we have been asking many of these questions in the legislature for months now. And I'm really pleased that we've finally been able to receive the Auditor General's report. It certainly begs the question why the government refused to answer those questions, why they obfuscated in the legislature. I've already said what I think is behind this, and I think it is corruption. I think it goes to the very top, and we've laid out what we want the government to, the action we think they should take immediately. I just want to reiterate them again. Immediately recall the legislature to reverse course and return those lands to the Greenbelt and cancel those deals with developers. The minister, Minister Clark, has to resign, and if he won't, he needs to be removed from cabinet immediately. And we need this Conservative government not to stand in the way of the Integrity Commissioner's investigation in any way, or any potential criminal investigation, because we know that this is just the beginning. We, and the people of Ontario, as we've, gone across the province over the many months, everybody said something smells not right about this, something smells fishy. Well, here we are today, and we know at least some of the truth, and we know how. We can conclude as to why, and we know that this is not and never has been about building housing, and certainly not addressing the affordability needs of Ontarians. And with that, happy to take your questions.
Today you're using the word corruption pretty freely. In days and weeks past, you have not. What specifically is corrupt about what the government's done here?
Well, I think if you look, at the end of the day, I think it's indefensible what we're seeing here, without question. If the premier or the minister want to come out and say, actually, we were just wildly incompetent, willfully blind, fine. Otherwise, I think it's pretty clear that these decisions serve the interests of Conservative Party donors and friends. A very few people made and will make a lot of money off of decisions that the Auditor General has made very clear do not serve the interests of Ontarians. That to me smells of corruption, and I think we need to call it that. And again, if the government wants to come out and defend what happened and say, no, we just didn't know, we're just that incompetent. I mean, this is the premier of this province. And as I read it, he also shared this. This was his request of his minister in the mandate letter, which, by the way, I will point out, they have yet to share. In fact, they're going to court to try to prevent people from reading their mandate letters. Well, here's why. Because this speaks to, who's actually needs to be held account for this government's decisions and what their real plan is for Ontario.
Should the housing minister's chief of staff be fired?
Should the housing minister's chief of staff be fired? Yes. I'm going to go further. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the minister himself who needs to be fired. He should have done the right thing from day one when we started asking these questions, because we've been asking these questions, right? We've been asking the government to explain why. So if they say that they didn't know, why didn't they know? How is it that for month after month after month, after we were asking questions, after you were asking questions, they didn't know the answers? Come on. We know somebody knew something, and if they didn't, if they had to have, what is it they call it, a plausible deniability, why? Why? Because they knew something didn't smell right. Because they knew that envelopes were exchanging hands at dinners, right? This is the kind of stuff that, I will say, as I go around this province, and I've mentioned this before here, people all across this province are concerned about losing that important land, that agricultural land. But they're also, as Catherine, as MPP Fife pointed out, they're deeply concerned that this government is wasting their dollars, is throwing away money to their friends, that there's corruption here. And I think the Auditor General's report shows that that is very, very much the case.
Well, right here, what the Auditor General said, she spoke to the OPP. She wouldn't say to what degree or really about what. The OPP is not investigating yet. They're still doing their, I think you put it once, an investigation of an investigation. What do you make of them the OPP not yet launching an investigation, and should they, given the evidence today?
Well, I can't speak to what the OPP is going to be investigating, and I don't know whether what's being revealed in these reports will change that. I don't know. I know that there's an investigation underway by the Integrity Commissioner right now. As we know, the Integrity Commissioner's mandate is pretty narrow, but we know that he's been interviewing folks. So we're hopeful that that he'll be able to, more information will come to light. But look, there's clearly something really bad at the very top, right? And at the end of the day, the buck stops with the Premier.
You said the Premier's fingerprints are all over this. The Auditor General just told us she met directly with the Premier, who said he had nothing to do with the decisions about land selection. Are you saying that the Premier directly lied to an officer of the legislature?
I am saying, if he didn't know, why didn't he know? If I would say that his response, I would call it somewhat implausible or dubious. I think I was looking for some good words to use. Dubious, implausible, doubtful. I feel that he may not have known, and in fact, I think she points out that there was this effort to be able to maintain plausible deniability, but to what end? He knew what he had mandated this minister to do and to accomplish. Did he think it was coincidence that only the people that have connections to his government, that have donated to his government, that so few would happen to be the successful, the winners in all of this? I mean, he had to know some of this. I can't believe he didn't. And again, if he wants to come out and say, you know what, I'm just wildly incompetent, great, go ahead. That's fine. I would say otherwise he was serving his friends. And if he didn't know, he should have known, and he has a responsibility. The buck stops with him.
When you use the word corruption, as you're using today, now the dictionary has a broad definition of it. I looked it up this morning. But most people hear that word and they hear bribes. You've mentioned envelopes. The envelopes in the report contain property information, not cash.
Yes.
We don't have any evidence whatsoever of individuals receiving cash under the table illegally, benefiting in a private sense. So when you say corruption, what do you mean?
That at the end of the day, people who donate to the Conservative Party, a very few people benefited enormously from these decisions that were made without the public interest in mind. Policies were changed to suit these people so that they would be successful. Like, to me, that speaks to corruption. And I don't know, Catherine, if you want to add something.
I just want to say the land is cash. That's it translates into billions of dollars. Even the 8.3, Jeff, is a 2016 MPAC assessment. That land is worth more today.
Listening says some of that money went in an envelope and went to, I don't know, the Premier, the Minister, the people working on this file. That's when people hear corruption, that's what they hear. And that's not what you're saying?
It's clear. I mean, look, the Conservative government have been receiving donations from these developers, right? So they're receiving donations, and decisions are being made to benefit a select few, folks who have extraordinary access. I don't know what else you could call it. I'm not shying away from it, because I think this report makes it pretty clear. And again, if the Premier wants to come out and say, "Oh no, I'm just really incompetent. Man, am I incompetent. I had no idea what my minister was up to, or any of my staff." I mean, I talk to my chief of staff multiple times a day and ask for, accountability. Here's the things I've asked to be conducted, to be done. I would expect that a minister would be asking the same of his chief of staff. I would expect that the Premier would be asking those questions. And my goodness, at very least over the last number of months, since we in the official opposition have been raising question after question after question after question, somewhere along the line, you didn't think to ask what's going on. Why didn't you want to know? Because you know that those donations are still coming in. That's why.
It another way, perhaps. So all along the allegations have largely been that somebody from the Ford government went, "Psst, buy land here. We're going to be opening it up." But now it seems from this report, what we're actually hearing is that the developers were saying, "Hey, open it up here." Which one's worse?
they're both bad. I mean, essentially, we have seen this government be heavily lobbied, and that backroom access comes with a cash amount through a donation. So, I mean, you can look at it this way. The Ford government chose to gift this land and steal it from the people of Ontario. And those people benefited, but the people of Ontario did not. I feel that that's very close to being corrupt. It certainly runs counter to the oaths that we take as MPPs. It runs counter to the Integrity Commissioner, reporting that we have to do on an annual basis. It undermines the public service and their advice, and we saw that in many respects this government was obstructing the public service from doing their due diligence on whether or not this land was environmentally sensitive, whether or not it was even possible to build housing on this land. I mean, so it is it's black and white in some regards, because on one side there's ethics and the other side there's none. So this is a huge issue for this premier and for this government, and it certainly compromises the trust that the people have in it. And when that happens, you have to address the people who are at the heart of it. And as Marit says, this is the minister responsible, Steve Clark, the chief of staff as well, and it deserves further investigation.
So Minister Clark is allowed to stay in his portfolio. What do you think that says about this government?
It says that this is a government that thinks it's above the law, that has made it very clear that Ontarians are not their priority.
That's right.
It's, I wish I could say I would be surprised if the premier doesn't ask the minister to step down, but I can't imagine any minister not recognizing themselves what a disaster this is. And, essentially what this government has done is they have transferred $8.3 billion of wealth away from everyday Ontarians, from regular people. It's reprehensible, and the minister has to take responsibility, and the premier. If the minister won't, the premier should have asked him to resign by now.
You talked a lot about legislative actions and recourses, but what can the public do? Because one thing we've learned from the Auditor General's report is that the public was shut out, municipalities were shut out, Indigenous communities were shut out. Is there any recourse you see for the public here?
The easy answer is in 2026 they can send a hell of a clear message. Yeah. But right now, that they should be doing what they've been doing. This is the part that's so frustrating. Ontarians have been making very clear what they want to happen here. They want the land back in the Greenbelt. They don't want it developed. Each one of these conservative MPPs and ministers and the premier certainly have heard from, I'm sure, countless of their constituents saying, this is not in our interest. They've heard from farming organizations who've said, this is extremely important farmland. Our food security depends on this. They've heard from environmental organizations saying, this is a really important carbon sink. These wetlands, these forests are important. None of this has worked. So I hope that at this point, the government will listen to the Auditor General. And this is why we want the legislature recalled. We want the government to come back, to reverse course, to put the land back in the Greenbelt. And frankly, we want an opportunity to get some other answers because we were elected as well to hold this government to account. And the people of the province of Ontario are counting on us to do that as well.
Given this report, how much confidence do you have in the Ford government's handling of Ontario Place and the Science Centre?
Oh my gosh. Well, I no confidence whatsoever. I think we've all lost confidence in this government's ability to not only we've lost confidence, if there ever was any, in this government's government working in the interest of Ontarians. Mm-hmm. They have shown, and we have it in the Auditor General report right now, that they are working to make some people very rich at the expense of everybody else. That this is not about building housing or creating opportunities even, that this is about some people getting really rich, and the premier getting what he wants. And that's unacceptable. That is not, we live in a democracy. And the people of this province, I think, have made their feelings about a lot of that very clear. I don't know if either of you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I just when people show you who they really are, you should believe them. And there's a pattern of behavior here from this government, which certainly does not put the people that were elected to serve first or at the center. And just around the public, what can the public do? I mean, we have to hold all MPPs accountable in this. Public accounts, the Auditor General serves the Public Accounts Committee. This report should be called. We should have deputations. We should invite the public to come and speak to it. We should pull the public into this process. And if the Premier wants to clear his name, that would be certainly a good first place to start.
I would just add, when I first was elected, I sat on the Select Committee for Financial Transparency that was struck by this government to investigate the actions of Kathleen Wynne, the Liberals, around the hydro financing. So this government has a track record of wanting other governments to be accountable, and I think that they should walk the talk when it comes to making sure that people in the province of Ontario get the answers that they deserve, that the transparency and the fairness that they expect was there and should be there.
It was a painful committee, but
yes,
it was interesting.
And people are still incensed and outraged. I'll just speak on the from Hamilton perspective. All across the province, there are people that continue to protest, continue to write MPs and councillors about. They know what has been sacrificed. They know what's at risk, and so they're not silent. They're not silent despite what you hear from the Ford government. People across the province have mobilized to say that this this land banking Greenbelt grab is not in their interest, and they know it.
It will also be interesting to hear from municipalities because they've been sidelined by this government at almost every turn. And really, they're going to be faced with very difficult budget cycles. We saw record high increases on property taxes across this province in response to Bill 23. If we're developing and we're creating more sprawl in the province of Ontario, that comes with a high price tag. And this government has been unwilling to support those municipalities in that work. And so it's going to come down to individual citizens in this province. And we're in a cost of living crisis. So it starts at the Premier's office, but it heads all the way down to local municipalities and towns who cannot, who are really in an untenable position with this very punitive government.
It's really extraordinary when you consider the lengths to which this government has gone to make sure that a few people get really, really wealthy, even more wealthy. When you consider what Ontarians are going through right now and the price they're already paying, whether it's the housing crisis, which is very real, the number of people out there who I've met, who have full-time jobs, who are going to food banks, or who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads because rent has gone so high. And this is what this government has been consumed with? This is what they're consumed with, this and the Science Centre? I think it's as we've all said here, it's reprehensible. And I know, they may think that they can get away with it with their flashy ads. By the way, I wonder how much they spent on that. Trying to pretend that this is, again, all about housing. The Auditor General has made it very clear this was never and will never be about housing. We can build the housing we need within the existing plans. There's no question. We do need to build more housing, but we also need to, take action like real rent control. That's going to have a really big impact on a lot of people's lives. This government made a choice. Doug Ford and the Conservatives made a choice. They chose to waste a ton of time and a lot of energy and a lot of resources and waste $8.3 billion in the end on to make some people very, very rich who were already very wealthy. So it's choices that they've made. And I know I really want to just sort of finish up again by saying how much I really appreciate the work of the Auditor General. You know, it's not partisan work. It's not political work. It's really important that we have those institutions in place because clearly we can't count on this government to come clean and answer truthfully the questions of Ontarians any other way.